Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on complex proliferation financing and sanctions evasion schemes. My name is Du Young. I've worked on this project since last year together with the project co-leads and the project team members who are here with us today. We're really happy to have you with us today. And before we begin, I will just quickly go over some of the housekeeping items to help things run smoothly, especially now that we will have almost 3,000 participants. So the session is being recorded and will be shared on the FATF's YouTube channel afterwards. And we are muting all the participants upon entry to minimize any background noise. And the webinar will be available in English and French during this session. So if you prefer French, please click the interpretation button at the bottom. You will see a little globe sign. And now let's take a look at today's agenda quickly before I hand it over to Matthew. The agenda items, the first slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So today's agenda, we will start with the introduction from the project co-lead Matthew, and we will follow with the 4 sessions covering key findings of each section of the report. And we will wrap up the webinar with the Q&A session and closing remarks by the project co-lead Masa. So thanks everyone again. And now I'm gonna hand over to Matthew to introduce the webinar.
Thank you, Du. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Spivak, and I work at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. I'm really honored to introduce the FATF's new report, Complex Proliferation Financing and Sanctions Evasion Schemes, and then highlight some key findings. This report is really the culmination of a major effort by a dedicated team of 30 experts drawn from 20 governments, 4 international organizations, and then in close collaboration with the FATF Secretariat. We also benefited from tremendous input from the private sector as well as civil society, whose insights were critical for shaping the final product. The result of this effort is a comprehensive report, and the report includes more than 40 case studies and typologies, highlighting techniques used to evade targeted financial sanctions related to proliferation financing under FATF's Recommendation 7, as well as other sanctions regimes. Our goal today is to really help you understand the evolving risk landscape and support more effective mitigation, both for governments and for the private sector. Now, before we dive into the report's findings, I just want to briefly touch on 2 reasons that this report matters. First, its urgency in today's illicit finance landscape, and then second, why it is particularly relevant for many of you participating today. So first on urgency. The world has changed dramatically since the FATF's last Proliferation Financing Typologies report in 2008. The current environment is marked by state and non-state actors using sophisticated procurement networks, revenue-raising schemes, and new technologies to support weapons and mass destruction programs and to evade detection. The scale and complexity of these threats is underscored by recent law enforcement actions, such as those announced last month by the U.S. Department of Justice. In one case, North Korean information technology workers used stolen and false identities to fraudulently gain remote employment with more than 100 U.S. companies across sectors, and that included many Fortune 500 firms. These schemes generated millions of dollars in illicit revenue for the DPRK's WMD program and relied on compromised bank accounts, on job platforms, as well as US-based enablers to operate undetected. But this example is really just the tip of the iceberg of the challenge that we face globally right now. Despite these growing threats, FATF mutual evaluations show that nearly half the jurisdictions lack an adequate legal framework to address proliferation financing, and less than 20% are effectively combating it. In short, we're really at a pivotal moment right now. Countering proliferation financing and sanctions evasion requires a collective leap forward. So why is this report particularly important for many of you? It's designed to support the work of competent authorities, financial institutions, designated non-financial businesses and professions, and virtual asset service providers in order to tackle sanctions evasion relevant to proliferation financing. It also aligns with a revised FATF Recommendation 1, which now requires jurisdictions and relevant entities to identify, assess, and understand their proliferation financing risks, and mitigation measures commensurate to those risks need to be implemented. For the public sector, this report can help inform your ongoing risk assessment processes. While many countries reported they assessed or will be assessing proliferation financing risks as part of their national risk assessment process right now, we saw indications that the extent of the assessment or understanding of proliferation financing vulnerabilities still in the early stages. For the private sector, the report may help inform how you assess risk exposure, detect suspicious activity, and strengthen controls as part of your broader compliance program. We received a lot of feedback from the private sector about the need for proactive outreach by the public sector on proliferation financing. With the revised FATF Recommendation 1 being evaluated in the next few years, you will see more engagement from authorities on these issues. But in the meantime, we hope this report can help you demonstrate proactive awareness and alignment with evolving FATF expectations. With a clear understanding for both the public and the private sectors, we can work together to start to close the gaps that remain on these issues. A good first step to understand how to do this is looking at current threats, systemic vulnerabilities, common typologies, and the most effective responses that we've seen to date. These are all topics we will be covering in this webinar. With that, I will now turn it over to my colleague, Arta, who will walk us through the current proliferation financing threat landscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Arta Tahira from Canada, and I would like to begin by thanking you all very much for joining us today. As Matthew mentioned, I will be providing an overview of the current situation, threat landscape, relevant to sanctions evasion and proliferation financing. Despite decades of international sanctions and countermeasures, state and non-state actors continue to adapt and use complex methods to sustain proliferation-related activities. Next slide, please. The DPRK remains a significant PF threat actor. Despite nearly 2 decades of UN sanctions, the DPRK continues to develop weapons of mass destruction capabilities. For instance, in October 2024, the DPRK launched its 11th intercontinental ballistic missile under its military expansion plan, demonstrating its continued defiance of international sanctions. The DPRK employs various tactics, including the use of intermediaries and obscure beneficial ownership structures to mask illicit financial flows, the exploitation of new technology, including cryptocurrency, and maritime tactics like ship-to-ship transfers and falsified documents to evade sanctions. These typologies and others will be discussed later on in the presentation. In terms of global monitoring, no new entities have been added to the UN's DPRK sanctions list in almost a decade. In addition, the recent dissolution of the United Nations 1718 panel of experts on the DPRK has left a critical gap in global monitoring, making it harder to track and address sanctions evasion activities, all while hampering the ability of countries to assess and address their PF risks related to the DPRK. Next slide, please. In essence, the report highlights 2 main factors that really contribute to the DPRK's financing of its weapons of mass destruction program. The first is North Korea's increasing financial connectivity. In late 2024, the DPRK-Russia Strategic Partnership Treaty committed both countries to deepening its economic cooperation, including banking ties and promoting a mutual understanding of economic and investment potentials of both regions. As of mid-2024, DPRK bankers in a neighboring country in Russia facilitated transactions valued at hundreds of millions of dollars to support the DPRK's trade and revenue generation, despite UN sanctions requiring their expulsion. The increased financial connectivity introduces vulnerabilities into the global financial system. The second factor is the DPRK's diversity of revenue generation activities, which further exacerbates threats of PF and sanctions evasion. For example, in early 2024, the DPRK's use of exports of wigs and false eyelashes accounted for nearly 60% of the DPRK's exports to a neighboring country. However, the goods were linked to sanctioned DPRK trading companies, which suggests that the wig revenue may be supporting the country's strategic weapons program. Other revenue streams include fraud, cyber theft, and the trafficking of arms, drugs, and wildlife. North Korea's fraudulent deployment of information technology workers, as Matthew mentioned earlier, will also be discussed later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Turning to Iran, Iran represents another complex and evolving PF threat. Iran was originally sanctioned by the United Nations after failure to comply with the Security Council Resolution 1696, which required that Iran cease its uranium enrichment program. While the United Nations targeted financial sanctions imposed on individuals and entities related to Iran were sunset in October 2023, a number of countries use national sanctions programs due to the threat posed by Iran and affiliated individuals and entities. Iran has relied on militarized proxies in the Middle East and transnational criminal networks that often leverage foreign exchange houses and banks to circumvent sanctions. Specifically, Hezbollah engages in extensive smuggling operations of oil, weapons, and a range of sanctioned goods. Hezbollah has been identified to act on Iran's behalf in direct contravention of sanctions. Next slide, please. Turning to Russia, as mentioned earlier, Russia's economic and military alignment with the DPRK has raised concerns about Russia's role as a PF threat by extension. As mentioned earlier, the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty has created new avenues for revenue generation that could support the DPRK's weapons of mass destruction program. In addition, there have been reports of DPRK soldiers deployed in the Russia-Ukraine conflict under this new bilateral treaty. These expanding economic and military relationships have raised alarm bells amongst countries who now view Russia as a PF threat by extension, further adding complexity to the proliferation financing and sanctions evasion landscape. Next slide, please. Beyond state actors, many countries remain concerned about the efforts of non-state actors, such as terror groups and criminal organizations, to acquire and/or source goods, knowledge, and technology related to weapons of mass destruction, including biological, chemical, and nuclear capabilities. While separate from the requirements under FATF Recommendation 7, the renewal of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540 in November 2022 reaffirmed the global commitment to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to non-state actors. While there are few examples of non-state actors exploiting the financial system to support PF actors or activities, many countries view the potential impact of this activity as important to monitor on an ongoing basis. Finally, there may be typologies from these activities that are relevant for understanding and mitigating the overarching proliferation financing and sanctions evasion risks. In essence, that concludes an overview of the current threat landscape, so I'll pass it on to my colleague Tanvi to discuss the vulnerabilities relevant to sanctions evasion and proliferation financing that can be exploited by illicit actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Orta. This was very interesting. So before I start, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I see we have reached 3,000 participants. And I would also like to thank all members who contributed to this project. So next slide, please. In our assessment, we noted that peer threat actors may exploit national or sectoral vulnerabilities to evade detection and sanction. And those vulnerabilities are evolving, which make it more challenging for public and private sector to understand and address PF-related risk. So for the purpose of this section, I'll be covering the most common national and sectoral vulnerabilities facilitating complex proliferation financing, considering the current global PF threats. So on my first slide, you will see I'll be talking about the economic and trade factors. It is important to consider those factors since illicit actors often target countries that are international financial hubs. These financial centers are attractive due to the broad range of services they offer, their large volume of global financial flows, and their transportation activities, especially in the context of an open economy. Countries with major ports and logistic infrastructure are often at risk of being used as a gateway to move dual-use goods, which are goods with both civilian and military uses. This is also why many countries in the global network spotlighted the importance of having custom agencies detect complex sanction evasion schemes. We also found countries maintaining economic or trade relationships with sanctioned states face increased PF and sanction evasion vulnerabilities. Some countries maintain historical and geopolitical ties with sanctioned countries, which can be exploited by threat actors to evade sanctions without the host country's knowledge and hence have access to the financial system and also resources. Next slide, please. Regulatory factors is also another important element. Despite the considerable progress that countries have made in strengthening AML safety frameworks, the global implementation of measures specifically targeting counter-proliferation financing is still significantly lagging. As you can see on the screen, we have seen 84% of countries having a moderate to low level of effectiveness with immediate outcome 11. And this gap poses serious challenges to the integrity of the global financial system and compliance with PF-related UN sanction obligations. Even in countries that have laws, detection and enforcement often lack the coordination, resources, or expertise needed to keep pace with the increasingly complex schemes employed by proliferators. The PF vulnerability which exists due to those regulatory gaps and also with ineffective export control, it deepens with countries having weak national laws on transparency of beneficial ownership for legal entities. This makes it further difficult for authorities to trace the financial flows or identify ultimate owners of assets in proliferation networks. Next slide, please. Moving on to the geographical and demographic factors. Several countries have reported that their geographic proximity to jurisdiction under UN, national, or supranational sanction regimes creates significant vulnerabilities. For instance, in East Asia, countries in close proximity to DPRK reported increased exposure to potential PF-related financial transactions and illicit shipment linked to proliferation activities. Also, strategically located countries often control vital shipping lanes and free trade zones, which raises the inherent vulnerability of neighboring countries. This is because these routes offer both cover and convenience for illicit proliferation networks. An often overlooked vulnerability, which I need to talk about, is the presence of diplomatic personnel and other representatives from jurisdiction under UN sanctions. These individuals play a role in moving assets, gathering sensitive information, or even overcoming routine enforcement mechanisms while circumventing restrictive measures. Next slide, please. Let's now have a look at the sectoral vulnerabilities, which are even more relevant to the private sector following us today. The sectors found to be most vulnerable to PF include the banking and other financial sectors, specifically those involved in facilitating cross-border transactions. Threat actors use a range of obfuscation techniques, including use of multiple accounts, falsified trade documents, and layering of transactions to disguise the true nature and purpose of financial flows. We have seen that trade finance, in particular, is frequently exploited to mask the movement of dual-use goods or sanctioned items. A specific area of concern is correspondent banking, which involves a lack of direct customer visibility, especially in a relationship involving jurisdiction with weak CPF control or having higher PF risk exposure. We also found vulnerabilities in complex account structures and account trade transactions, which often lack detailed data on goods and shipment purposes. Additionally, we have wire transfers, which are a major component of those financial transactions. We found they are efficient and rapid, yes, but often lack have limited information on the transaction purpose or supporting documentation, hence making them prone to be prime tools for sanction evasion. Next slide, please. Another important sector is the virtual asset and virtual asset service providers. Here, I would like to emphasize the growing concerns about the use of virtual assets in proliferation financing. Many countries have reported an increase in the use of virtual assets to move funds across borders, including with the intent to avoid traditional financial oversight. Proliferation financing networks are actively exploiting the uneven implementation of preventive measures for VSPs, particularly with the delayed adoption of Recommendation 15 as required under the FATF standards. Even in jurisdictions having regulation in place, we have observed compliance weaknesses among VSPs, hence allowing PF actors to operate with greater anonymity and agility, hence increasing the vulnerability of this sector. We have also observed techniques being used, such as the use of mixed services, decentralized finance arrangement, and anonymity-enhancing cryptocurrencies, which are frequently being used to launder proceeds from large-scale stolen virtual assets, including those linked to DPRK's WMD program. These obfuscation tools make it extremely difficult to trace transactions or identify the true origin or destination of the funds. As a result, virtual assets are playing an increasingly central role in funding proliferation activity. Next slide, please. We also have new and alternative payment infrastructure, which is an area to consider, given that we noted that some state and non-state actors are turning to alternative payment systems to bypass traditional financial channels for the purpose of circumventing sanctions. The increased use of local currency settlement, alternatives to SWIFT, and digital platforms like peer-to-peer payment services and digital remittance providers have been noted. Next slide, please. I would like to conclude my slides by speaking about the other sectoral vulnerabilities we found, departing from traditional financial sectors. So we have seen sectors such as trust and company service providers involved in the formation of complex legal structures, and DNFBPs such as dealers in precious metals and stones, which are particularly exposed to proliferation financing and sanction evasion risk. DNFBPs, by nature of the type of services they offer, they have high value, easy to transport stores of value, and hence providing an alternative method for sanctioned parties to move financial resources across international borders. Additionally, there are sectors like aeronautics, maritime industries, nuclear power, and shipbuilding that have been identified as vulnerable to exploitation given their relevance to dual-use goods and technologies. You will have much more insight about how these sectors can be misused by perpetrators in complex PF and sanction evasion schemes in our next presentation on typologies. Thank you for your attention, and over to you, Maida. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanvi. Hi, everyone. I'm Maida Dabashish from His Majesty's Treasury in the UK. As trailed by others, today I'll be presenting on the common typologies and the key methods that are used by illicit actors in complex PF and sanctions evasion schemes. To do this, I'll be drawing on some case studies that have been highlighted in the report and get into them further on in the presentation. So to start off with, the report sets out 4 main typologies. These are the use of intermediaries to evade sanctions, the obscuring of beneficial ownership information to access the financial system, the use of virtual assets and other technologies, and the exploitation of the maritime and shipping sector. So within these typologies, countries reported various methods and categories of activities that are used in sanction evasion schemes. And I'll explain these further in detail later on in the presentation. So next slide, please. So the report considers a range of case studies when considering typologies. These case studies illustrate both the evasion of PF-related targeted financial sanctions, specifically related to the DPRK, as well as evasions of other national and supranational sanctions regimes that are not required by the FATF standards. In considering this broad set of case studies, the project team was able to develop a more comprehensive and up-to-date understanding of threats, vulnerabilities, and complex challenges across various typologies. Next slide, please. So the first typology that the report discusses is the use of intermediaries to evade sanctions and facilitate the movement of dual-use goods. In particular, the report finds that complex evasion schemes see the use of intermediaries in the following ways. So 1, the use of shell and front companies. Illicit actors use these companies to access financial systems, facilitate payments and contracts, and import and export goods under false pretenses. Secondly, through complex transit routes and hubs in third countries. These are used to move funds and commodities to and from sanctioned regimes. And thirdly, we saw the use of bank accounts in third countries and access to multiple financial institutions across the world being used in these schemes. One case study which illustrates this quite well is from Australia. So in 2021, the New South Wales Supreme Court charged an Australian citizen for contravening DPRK-related sanctions law. In this case, the individual used offshore bank accounts as well as Australia-based front companies to broker trade with the DPRK in a variety of goods. So these included Iranian petrol bought on behalf of the DPRK, missiles, and kind of other missile-related technology. So much like kind of other examples in the report, this case study demonstrates how complex schemes use intermediaries, but also how they're using different types of intermediaries to mask the origin, destination, and purpose of funds when evading PF-related sanctions. Next slide, please. So the second typology that was considered in the report was the evasion of sanctions through the obscuring of beneficial ownership information. So in complex evasion schemes, tactics often involve the falsification of beneficial ownership information and the blurring of the ultimate destination of funds. The report finds that sanctions evasion schemes obscure beneficial ownership information using multiple ways. So through third-party facilitators, such as foreign-based front companies and foreign nationals, unlicensed financial facilitators, subsidiaries in places with weaker AML-CFT controls, and illegally obtained debit and credit cards under false names. Using these methods, and by hiding kind of the true originator, beneficiary, and purpose of transactions, illicit actors are able to move funds through international financial systems in a way that's undetected. One case study which shows this is from the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, illegal trust and company service providers were used to help set up Dutch legal entities to mask financial flows and obscure transactions. The funds were allegedly from Iran, and they were being passed through major financial centers before being unlawfully transferred to Dutch entities. In this case study, there was a complex use of recognized reference companies and illegal TCSPs to obscure one, who was behind the companies, but also to conceal the source and purpose of the funds. By the time the funds reached their financial destination, the trail had been deliberately fragmented. And at this point, financial institutions at various points in the trail would not have been able to kind of view the scheme in its complete form. In this case, additionally, transactions involve tech firms, and with this, that kind of created the concerns around dual-use goods and how kind of tech firms were being used. Overall, I would say in this case, obscuring beneficial ownership information and the transactional context was used not only to evade sanctions, but importantly, it was used to facilitate the movement of funds through the financial system in a way that would avoid triggering red flags. Next slide, please. The third typology that was used in the report was the use of virtual assets and other technologies. So virtual assets are being used to facilitate financial flows, both directly to sanctioned countries, but also indirectly through third countries with differing sanctions regimes. As already kind of mentioned by Tanvi, vulnerabilities and gaps in regulatory systems related to VASPs have enabled their use in PF networks, often without detection or disruption. Sanctions evasion schemes are using increasingly sophisticated methods to move funds, so through virtual assets, anonymity-enhancing technologies such as mixers, decentralized finance arrangements, and cross-chain bridges to obscure sources and destination of funds, but also to kind of generate funds. So we see the sector being targeted by sanctioned actors through cyber activity and cyber attacks to kind of generate funds for various regimes. One example of this was in 2024 in South Korea, where the country sanctioned an entity as well as 15 individuals for generating funds, launching cyber attacks, and stealing virtual assets on behalf of the DPRK. These individuals included managers of the 313 General Bureau, which is an organization controlling the DPRK's R&D of weapons and military equipment. With the help of facilitators abroad, the DPRK was also using virtual wallets, banks, e-finance platforms, and fiat currency accounts to convert and move funds. And ultimately, these funds were being used to purchase sanctioned supplies and finance the regime's WMD program. More broadly, we're seeing kind of the digital economy and emerging technologies present new challenges for the sanction space. So this has already been mentioned by a few other presenters, but countries have found that, for example, the DPRK is exploiting the IT sector and deploying its workers to other parts of the world using false identities. And this is helping generate funds for their regime. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then finally, the fourth typology in the report is the use of the maritime and shipping sectors. So this is not specifically covered by the FATF standards, but when reaching out to countries, many identified this as a key vulnerability, as well as a sanctions evasion typology. So the maritime industry involves a vast network of vessels, ports, logistics, international regulations that actors are exploiting when they're evading sanctions and generating revenue for PF purposes. Tactics often include things like obscuring the identity of merchant vessels, manipulating identification system broadcasts, falsifying documents reviewed by customs authorities, and using ship-to-ship transfers to disguise origins and destinations of shipments. In Singapore, there was an example of this in 2019 when an individual allegedly conspired with 5 other individuals to supply over 12,000 metric tons of gas oil to the DPRK using shipping vessels. So allegedly, the individual used the following tactics. So he used a company where he was a director and an associate bank account to receive payments. On 2 occasions, he allegedly falsified documents belonging to this company, as well as another company considered to be under his control. More broadly, in terms of the movement of goods, ship-to-ship transfers were used, with various ports being involved, and the final port being in the DPRK. All in all, by doing this, he was able to obscure the destination of the delivery, but the receipt of payments for his activity. That's kind of like the final case study I was going to discuss. And it brings me to the end of my presentation on trends and methods. As a final thought that I would like to leave you all with, throughout kind of the typology section of the report, you can see not only how actors deploy a range of methods to evade sanctions, but how they use these together to create those sophisticated international schemes and how they complexify their methods and overall activity to make it difficult for law enforcement to detect and disrupt. I know David's going to be speaking on that a bit more, so I'd like to hand over to him now to go into that in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meta, and good day, everybody. My name is David Shannon. I'm acting Deputy Executive Secretary of the Asia Pacific Group on Money Laundering. It's a real pleasure to be on the webinar today and have the chance to present to such a big group, and especially to support the project team. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about a number of the challenges and opportunities in relation to detecting, investigating, and taking action. And given that so much of the audience for the webinar today are individuals from the private sector and also from the academic research sector and other key government officials and from international organizations, there are a range of points in these areas that I'll present, but especially in our report, that are of critical importance to the work, the vital work that you do in relation to taking measures to identify and take action against sanctions, proliferation, sanctions evasion. I just want to mention a few key areas in relation to detecting PF and sanctions evasion through screening in relation to suspicious matters and also possible matches with identified targeted financial sanctions. The first and most obvious point, of course, is that sanction screening is a critical aspect here. We all know that, and it's very important. And as this report points out, that this is including the entirety of those UN sanctions, but also autonomous, targeted, and other financial sanctions in relation to national regimes. And so, for the work in relation to the implementation of these important measures, the report points out a number of areas of good practice in relation to aspects of sanctions screening. And this report should also be read with a wider range of FATF and materials produced by FATF-style regional bodies and other important international organizations that point out state practice, for example, through mutual evaluation reports that include very detailed analysis of state practice and good practice here to identify effective implementation of sanctions screening regimes. A few areas just to highlight. Of course, the importance of comprehensive systems for screening in relation to names and related parties, to using the red flag indicators that are provided by national authorities and also in some cases by international organizations, but especially those that are generated by the private sector or in some studies or reports of academic research sectors and others, in order to support more comprehensive and more granular sanctions screening. It's very important also to look in this screening in relation to the identified sanctions evasion risks that are increasingly available because of the change in FATF standards requiring each country or jurisdiction to conduct assessments of sanctions evasion risks, and in many cases, countries are doing much more comprehensive proliferation financing risk assessments and sharing both public versions of those risk assessments and best practice is actually also to include much more detailed findings in relation to the assessments of risk with affected parties, with the private sector and with government agencies and so on, to ensure that sort of deepened and more effective sanctions screening. We see good practice, and a lot of the case studies you've seen here reflect an approach to focusing on not just those designated persons and entities under targeted financial sanctions, but also those sectoral sanctions, those activity-based sanctions, and the identified vigilance measures in various United Council's Security Council resolutions, but also other statements that have been put out by national governments in relation to aspects of proliferation financing risk and the opportunities for sanctions to be evaded to generate funds. Very importantly, in relation to the process of that screening, the architecture and the systems and the approaches that are implemented in the private sector for monitoring for suspicion and in relation to customer profiles, monitoring of transactions, applying systems and individuals to match up possible red flags and to escalate matters of suspicion or unusual transactions or profiles that may differ from those that are well established. That these systems are absolutely critical for the implementation. So that is applying the traditional AML CFT architecture that's in place in the private sector institutions to ensure that that's completely available and applied also to look at sanctions screening and complement sanctions screening and to deal with this whole issue of complexity. So the important thing here, we've seen good practice in relation to these areas, in relation to in the private sector, sharing systems, approaches for national governments to help small and medium enterprises that are covered entities, that are reporting entities, to subsidise some aspects of screening systems, but most particularly to support them with increased and improved information in relation to the specific risks and threats that they need to look for, and in some cases more detailed information sharing between various government actors to help implementing agencies to better target their screening systems and to go down further into the trails. So an opportunity here is for the private sector to work together to share best practice and share systems, and if you like, to demand or to request or to collaborate with government agencies in relation to the type of risk information that they require to better implement their sanction screening processes and to better calibrate their monitoring systems and to support the staff that actually operate all those systems to deal in this increasingly complex environment. So the case studies that you see in the report, they really illustrate the complexity very well and the challenge that's there with the private sector. And so governments and international organizations need to continuously produce up-to-date and improved information to help all of you do your jobs more effectively. Next slide, please. So the important consideration here, in some cases, there's a narrative in relation to sanctions screening that the point of there being a match and assets being frozen and reported to competent authorities is considered by some to be the end of a process, but in fact, really, it's just the beginning. It's the beginning of that process for competent authorities to work with the private sector, those agencies, those businesses that may have identified sanctions evasion assets that are being frozen, to uncover networks, to find incidents, to uncover the capabilities of threat actors, and to take steps in relation to doing something about these significant threats to international peace and security. So the continuum in relation to PF investigation, it's very important here that we also look completely in the intelligence space, but that right through to criminal justice interventions, including, in a minute, we'll talk about prosecutions. So the private sector has such an important role here. It's not just at the point of there being a detection or a match, but actually in the back and forth in relation to the work that goes on in relation to developing intelligence, conducting investigations, and moving towards sanctioning through prosecution or other actions that are taken. So the commencement or the continuation of in-depth financial investigations is really a critical aspect that you can see illustrated in the case studies in the report. The case studies don't set this out necessarily, but of course, a number of cases may actually be connected or by virtue of agencies taking a long-term view around particular networks and particular areas of threat. And so the work of these investigations, of course, are looking at the sanctions evasion event, the overall conduct that's behind that fundraising, and including possible measures in relation to specific WMD proliferation activities. There are increased challenges in the intelligence and criminal investigation stages due to sensitivities and the need to consider national security, intelligence, and in some cases defence agency concerns in relation to how explicit some investigation activities will end up being in relation to criminal justice matters being taken forward and other types of preventive interventions that might be considered. So as a sensitive subject, you recognise in relation to the sensitivities of the investigation stage. Next slide, please. And then the complexity of investigations, of course, is reflected in the complexity of the prosecution process and the evidence that needs to be drawn together to carry forward prosecutions in relation to sanctions evasion cases and WMD proliferation cases. And so in a similar kind of way, that continuum that I spoke of before, that there are, you see case studies in the report that cover a number of different types of proliferation financing matters, including sanctions evasion, but also very complex matters themselves with very complex evidence, particular in relation to cyber attacks and complex digital evidence, and the need in some countries, in some jurisdictions, there will be cases of first instance, really quite novel matters that need to come before the courts. And so this is a particular challenge in some countries when these detections happen in jurisdictions with relatively weak capacity and in relation to bringing these matters to court. And so the need for international cooperation is highlighted very strongly in the report. And this is something similar in relation to complex money laundering schemes as well as terrorist financing. It's no different if anything, the complexity is higher in some of these cases in relation to proliferation financing. And I also to mention as well as prosecutions that there may be a number of other related activities that are taken forward by national authorities. Next slide, please. So interagency cooperation, of course, is absolutely critical. There's, for good reason, FATF standards address this to a large extent in relation to proliferation financing as a fundamental aspect of comprehensive responses to both preventive measures and then to identify and take action against proliferation financing and related sanctions evasion. So the opportunities and challenges we see are comparable and akin to those that FATF reports have identified in relation to money laundering and terrorist financing, both in the intelligence side and the financial investigation side, but also the oversight and the supervision and the guidance and the support to the private sector, including those challenges that relate to agencies that are responsible for transparency of beneficial ownership of legal persons and trusts and other legal arrangements. And so this complex, because the proliferation financing subject crosses so many government actors, that there are particular challenges for interagency cooperation. It is worth identifying that the areas of particular risk and that have been already highlighted by some of the presenters today, for example, in relation to maritime sectors, dual use goods, areas relating to special economic zones, and so on and so on, that in some cases these may involve competent authorities that are not the typical ones involved in anti-money laundering, interagency coordination and cooperation, and including a closer collaboration with security intelligence agencies. And so this can bring some particular challenges in relation to interagency cooperation and information sharing. So this they're not insurmountable complexities, but there are particular sensitivities that we would identify, and we have seen in some countries that need to be overcome with particular types of interagency arrangements, including aspects of access to systems, the need for certain security clearances, and so on, that in relation to ensure that agencies can work together quickly and seamlessly in relation to detecting and taking action on proliferation financing. Next slide, please. And then information sharing between the public and private sectors is absolutely critical here. The report highlights in a number of areas that the need for closer collaboration and the benefits and the opportunity in relation to deepening that collaboration, and especially information sharing between public and private sectors. Public-private partnerships is the hot topic, and sometimes that phrase is used, and we think we all know exactly what that means. But this may vary greatly country to country, and in relation to particular sectors, how that's conducted, and the depth of information that's required, and the way and the types of agencies that would be required in sharing that information. At times, it's case by case, or it's sector by sector, or it may relate to particular areas of threat in relation to sanctions evasion. What we see here is that the increased work by countries to assess their proliferation financing risks, it also leads those countries to more critically consider where there have been gaps in cooperation between the public sector and the private sector, and opportunities to provide more targeted information. So the sanction screening processes, of course, always requires better information to support, and that same approach in relation to identifying unusual and suspicious transactions and misalignment with customer profiles and so on is really needs to be supported by up-to-date guidance and advisories and specific intelligence and information sharing from government authorities. And also, as I mentioned before, the opportunity to collaborate on systems, on providing information to better calibrate monitoring tools, and then joint engagement in relation to risk assessments. final thing I would say here is that in many cases for competent authorities, the evolution of complex financial activities and products is also the need for the private sector to ensure that regulators and those agencies involved in supporting counter-proliferation financing measures are as up to date as possible, especially in the evolving landscape in relation to virtual assets. So the public-private partnership here is sort of information flowing in both directions. Next slide, please. And then finally, international cooperation. This remains absolutely critical. That this is, again, this is akin to those vital needs in relation to money laundering and terrorist financing. But the timescales here need to be even shorter, much shorter, in fact, in some cases. And there are, again, significant challenges in relation to the sensitivities of some of these matters. And also the fact that that some of these frameworks are particular to a particular jurisdiction, but may not exactly flow from agreed positions of the United Nations. So there are some sensitivities around particular matters and again around national security concerns, but there are great opportunities for involvement of stakeholders, as I mentioned, that go beyond the typical anti-money laundering agencies. And I would highlight there's been a mention of areas including, of course, customs, but in relation to proliferation financing and the focus on maritime issues, that agencies that are involved in trade and port regulation and the exchange of information in relation to international shipping, the role of shipping registries and so on, that there are areas here where there may be diagonal international cooperation that needs to be better supported. And the national risk assessments looking at proliferation financing also need to identify those challenges and opportunities in the area of international cooperation. And this is increasingly being focused on and improved and is being reflected in the mutual evaluation report findings that we are publishing. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'll hand over to Masa.
No, thanks. Thanks, David, everyone. Sorry, I'm just hearing an echo. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, David and everyone for all your insightful presentations. We will now move on to the Q&A session. So I'd like to start with a quick note about today's Q&A session format. Due to time limitations, we won't be holding a live Q&A session during the webinar. Instead, we'll be focusing on questions that were submitted to us through the online registration form in advance. This will really allow us to address the most relevant topics within the limited time we have. So over the past 2 weeks, we received more than 2,000 questions from the private sector, public sector, and civil societies, which were all very helpful in shaping today's webinar. So thank you very much for that. If you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to email them to us after the webinar. We will try our best to get back to you as soon as possible. So I am now going to read out the questions and invite our speakers to respond. Our first question is, when institutions have scarce resources, which of the PF typologies should be viewed as more likely than others? Should the focus be on complex schemes or simpler ones? Matthew, would you like to answer this question? Thanks.
Thank you, Du. Yeah, I'm happy to answer that first question. First, I also want to thank all the presenters also, as Du just did. You did a great job bringing this report to life. If participants have not yet had a chance to read the report, I hope this discussion inspires you to take a look. So now turning to the question on scarcity of resources, it's a good question, and it is something that we really tried to consider closely when developing this report over the past year and then deciding which typologies and risk indicators to spotlight. Proliferation financing is unique, but there are opportunities to lean on best practices from your broader efforts to address other illicit finance activities. This is something that was also referenced by David a moment ago. So when resources are scarce, institutions should apply a risk-based approach, focusing on the typologies that are most relevant to their specific risk exposure, whether that is based on jurisdiction, sector, customer base, business model, or anything else that you consider to be a key consideration when you're assessing risk. Therefore, the way that we've looked at it, in particular in this report, is less about focusing on complex or simpler schemes, but instead on identifying which schemes pose the highest risk to your specific institution. What's more likely will differ certainly from one institution to another, The report offers a range of case studies and risk indicators to help inform this process. The process of ensuring how you allocate finite resources, where they will have the greatest impact, and then also in mitigating proliferation financing and sanctions evasion risk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthew. The next question we have is, could you provide further insights into the use of complex beneficial ownership structures in the DPR case PF and associated challenges?
I can jump in and take this one. Thank you so much, Stu, for the question. In essence, the DPRK employs sophisticated methods to obscure beneficial ownership information, which is central to its proliferation financing and sanctions evasion strategies. These methods can include the use of subsidiaries and front and shell companies that conduct legitimate appearing transactions to mask the links to sanctioned entities. The complex beneficial ownership structures make it extremely difficult for authorities and financial institutions to trace the flow of funds and to enforce sanctions effectively. This really highlights the need for transparency in corporate registries, effective beneficial ownership frameworks, as well as international cooperation. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Arta. The next question is on AI. We actually received a lot of questions regarding AI. So the question goes, has AI been playing a role in bad actors or illicit actors trying to evade sanctions?
Thank you, Joe. So I'll probably take this question. So if for those who have been able to take a chance and really read the report, we briefly mentioned on AI. And this is to recognize that AI has begun to play a role in the evolving landscape of sanction evasion. Though the extent and the amount of information about the involvement of AI is limited at this stage, and it will be difficult to really draw a conclusion. But this is also to say that we cannot undermine AI as being a potential tool for illicit actors. For example, in automating obfuscation techniques, I think illicit actors can make use of AI for that. If we look also at about the VSPs, there's the cryptocurrency and blockchain ecosystem. For instance, AI could potentially assist in enhancing mixing services. And around those vulnerabilities I had discussed earlier, I think AI can probably help illicit actors to anonymize transaction and enhance concealment to evade sanctions. And this is also why FATF flags that artificial intelligence is an emerging area as part of new technologies to closely monitor, given the rapid evolution of AI capabilities and also the increasing sophistication of threat actors. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tanvi. Next question concerns crypto assets. So what are the risks and challenges posed by virtual assets and service providers in PF and sanctions evasion?
Thanks, Stu. I'll take that question on. So the risks and challenges posed by virtual assets and virtual asset service providers are significant and also quite multifaceted. PF networks often exploit the lack of effective implementation of AML, CFT, CPF measures for VASPs, especially in jurisdictions that are non-compliant or only partially compliant with the FATF recommendation 15. Illicit actors use virtual assets to raise and move funds pseudonymously, often employing obfuscation techniques such as mixing services, anonymity, enhancing cryptocurrencies, and unregulated VASPs. These methods make it quite difficult for authorities to trace transactions and attribute them to sanctioned entities. The international nature of virtual assets also presents a challenge in verifying jurisdictions of foreign VASPs, coordinating international cooperation, and managing differences in the regulatory frameworks across the world. This complexity is kind of compounded by the use of decentralized finance platforms, cross-chain bridges, and kind of other methods which further obscure the flow of funds. I think given the kind of risks that are evolving quite quickly in this space and what seem to be risks that are quite ever-changing, going back to kind of what David said earlier, it is important for the private sector to continue to update and interact with competent authorities to kind of identify and address these emerging risks, especially in the virtual asset space. And I think with that, I would like to go back to Du.
Thanks, Meta. Next question, I think is for you, David. How can international organizations better support the private sector to counter PF?
Thanks very much, Du. And thank you very much to the participants for putting in so many questions in relation to these very important matters. Look, actually building on Meta's point and the point I made earlier, actually the private sector requesting national authorities to give them better information, it's really also that issue that national authorities really need to work with international organizations to really seek support between countries to ensure that there are more concrete actions that can be taken to better support the private sector in their countering proliferation financing. So that's really the first thing, is that those international organizations, and including FATF and APG, can and are taking concrete actions. The first key area, I suppose, that international organizations can focus on is in relation to supporting more robust and approaches that are sort of suitable to individual markets and countries, that supports better private and public partnerships and information sharing with the private sector. That this may look a little bit different between different countries, but in systems and approaches that are going to be most suitable to the national context, and to ensure that there can be a deepened approach and improved trust, and bringing the private sector in a more concrete way, taking into account the risks that have been identified. On that part, actually, the international organizations can very much support national authorities to do a better job of assessing proliferation financing risks and generating guidance and sharing information. The report emphasizes that the private sector too often has to rely on suspicious activity reports to detect proliferation financing, but they don't have sufficient actionable information and intelligence to support their monitoring and their detection of sanctionable entities, sanctioned entities in relation to transactions or assets that are held or controlled by financial institutions or designated non-financial businesses, or by BASPs. It's very important that international organizations can take some steps to bridge some of the gaps and to work with national authorities and to promote platforms and mechanisms that support governments and show good practice for developing and sharing typologies, red flags and risk indicators, and involving the private sector in all that work, in both that development of typologies, and also the sharing in the way that can be done through organizations that bring the private sector together, and also that engage with the research and academic sector in this important endeavor. And it also can ensure that as the pressure continues to bring for more countries to better regulate and support virtual asset service providers, that as Du mentioned, that and others have mentioned, that there is still much further to go, but that this is an area of the faster that can move forward, then the broader coverage in relation to this sanctions screening and the better cooperation there can be and information sharing with the private sector. And then another point to mention that I really want to emphasize is that international organizations can really help to support and promote coordinated outreach and especially training. Many private sector entities, that there's always a need for them to have improved capacity building, but especially improved guidance and support, and in relation to both risk and risk mitigation. And so the FATF has focused on consultative forums and different platforms or approaches that are going to be suitable for every country. And international organizations have an important part in that. Finally, on that point, I would say that a number of international organizations also focus very much, of course, on technical assistance and training, both to national authorities, but also to look at opportunities for technical assistance and training that can involve the private sector directly in this area in relation to supporting sanctions screening and implementation of targeted financial sanctions, and in areas including supporting the conduct of enterprise risk assessments with better guidance, sharing good practice, and assisting national authorities to better support the private sector in this regard. So to come back to my first point here, it's very important that the private sector talks to national authorities and national authorities talk to international organizations so that there can be a joined up effort whereby the international community actually can more somewhat indirectly, but can support individual enterprises in doing a better job in this area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. The last question, it brings us back to actually why we're having this webinar today and why we published the report last month. So why does FATF release this report amongst the 5th round of mutual evaluation?
Thank you, Dole. Let me answer this question from me. My name is Masa Matsuo from the Ministry of Finance, Japan. I'm co-lead of the project along with Matthew Spivak at the US Treasury. Thank you for asking this very important point as well. We have a couple of reasons that we completed the project and released the final report now, which was referenced in this webinar. First, the FATF's 5th round of mutual evaluations places a greater emphasis on understanding and mitigating PF risks. This report aims to support the public and private sectors in meeting those expectations. Second, the 5th round of mutual evaluations showed that many jurisdictions struggled to address PF, and this report attempts to show how PF networks and exploiting weakness in CPF and controls. Last but not least, the PF and sanctions evasion threat landscape is evolving rapidly day by day, so the public and private sectors need to be ready to tackle the more complex and cross-border financial scheme described in the report. That could be an answer from my side. Thank you, Dole.
Thanks, Masa. So many thanks again to everyone who submitted questions and also to all our speakers for their valuable responses. So that wraps up our Q&A session. And now I will hand it over back to Masa to close the webinar.
Thank you, Dole, again. Let me make some brief closing remarks. First of all, I truly appreciate all your attendance at today's webinar on the complex proliferation financing and sanction evasion schemes. I also thank today's presenters, Alta, Tambi, Medha, and David, upon our final report, which was adopted by the FATF plenary last month. In addition, I cannot forget to mention the tremendous supports provided by the FATF Secretariat. Thanks to all the support, we are proud of having today's webinar to present the final report. As my colleague have already presented the essential elements of the report, the original purpose of this project is to provide necessary and practical information for the FATF Global Network members to be able to develop their own proliferation financing risk assessments in a proper way to prepare for the 5th mutual evaluation reports and going forward. Therefore, we try to make this report as practical as possible for the global network. In my concluding remarks, let me highlight just one thing. Since I know that so many participants are coming today from both competent authorities and the private sector, let me emphasize again here the importance of enhancing the engagement between public and private sectors. This March, we conducted a public consultation to ask comments and feedback to our project and topics regarding the complex proliferation financing and sanction evasion schemes. We received over 400 comments from the private sector entities today, and so we also have so many questions as well. Most of them clearly demonstrated their strong demand and interest in achieving a broader picture and the practical information, including an updated our report focusing on the PF and sanction evasion schemes. We really hope our project report will help strengthen the engagement between public and private sectors. For your reference, in Japan, we are also planning to conduct outreach sessions for private sectors with the Japanese translated version of our final report. Finally, I truly hope today's session should be helpful for all the attendees. thank you for participating. We look forward to your future collaboration on this important topic. I will pass the floor, go back to the DO Secretariat for your final announcement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Masa, again. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, all the presenters and all the participants. So as we mentioned at the beginning, the recording will be available on the FATF's YouTube channel, and you will receive a link to the channel with in an email shortly today or tomorrow. So thank you again, and then thank you also for waking up or staying up late to join us today. Have a great day or have a good night, and see you soon.